Welcome back to day 2 of my 65 days of Typescript Challenges challenge. And today we're gonna have a look at our first interesting challenge. It's called the Pig Challenge. And we're just gonna load that up. Something I noticed when I first loaded up this challenge was that, yeah, okay, yeah, exactly what's happening here. Cannot find module type challenges. Yeah, so this happens sometimes, and I think the way I fix this is just refresh. Um, okay, that didn't work. The exact way I fixed this the first time was I opened up the first challenge. Still not working. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything else that we can do outside from refreshing, to be honest. So let's just give that a couple of refreshes. Hopefully it works soon. Okay, no. Okay, you know what? Let's be a bit more. Let's do a hard refresh. Inspect. I'm not quite sure why this happens, but obviously for some reason it's not it's not going away to find the module type challenges utils, even though that exists. So let's hope that a hard refresh that clears the cache and actually reloads everything from scratch um, helps us. Okay, cool. So in the future, maybe we'll just try a hard refresh from the get-go. Right, so this challenge is interesting because we're going to be implementing a utility type that's included in the TypeScript standard library. And the idea is given a type, you want to generate another type which contains only a subset of the properties of the original type. So in this case, we're giving title, description, and completed, but we want to generate another type that contains just title and completed, ignoring description. And the syntax for that is we invoke our type, our utility type, it's called myPick, and then we pass it the type from which we want to remove some properties, and then we specify the properties we want to retain. Interestingly, we don't specify the properties we want to remove, but we specify the properties we want to retain, which is kind of annoying if you want to retain everything except just one. So I imagine there must be another utility type out there that allows you to specify just the property you want to remove and generate a subtype that contains just the properties you want with the ones you want removed gone. Okay, so that's the idea of what we're doing. So let's have a look at our tests. We're going to have a look at our test, and then we're going to try and implement the myPick type to achieve what we want. And the process, we're going to learn about two TypeScript concepts that I have written about in my blog. One of them is using map types to do the equivalent of the for loop in JavaScript in the value space. And the other one is using the extend operator to do the equivalent of constraining a JavaScript value to either a number or a string. So we do the equivalent of that in the type space by using the extend keyword or operator to constrain a type to only a fixed set that we're interested in. And I'll show how those two come together to help us build out a myPick type that um, that passes all these test cases. So two things I mentioned: mapped types And the other thing I meant to mention is the extends keyword to constrain typesets to do map types to do a for loop equivalent. Right. The last thing that's interesting here is that we're going to talk about is the TS expect error comment. So the way this works is if the line after it is expected to throw an error, and it does throw an error, then TypeScript doesn't complain. We don't get a squiggly line. But if the line after it is expected to throw an error, but it doesn't throw an error, then TypeScript complains, telling you that, hey, look, this thing is meant to throw an error, but it's not throwing an error, something's wrong. So three things we're supposed to accomplish here is pass these two test cases and remove this squiggly line. So let's get cracking. First thing we want to do is remove that any and think of what exactly we're trying to achieve. We know we're going to be passed a type that contains all the type properties, and then we're going to be passed another type that contains all the properties we want to retain. So the first thing we're going to want to do is loop through all the properties we want to retain, and for each of those properties, we're going to access the type of those properties, and then when we're done looping through everything, we're going to return an object that contains the properties and the types returned, right? So let's do that looping. In TypeScript, the for loop construct equivalent is a map type, and the syntax for a map type is done using what we call the in operator. So we're going to define some I was about to say generic type, but the phrase generic type has a very specific meaning. So rather than saying generic type, I'm going to say we're going to define some type variable. We'll call it x, and the equivalent of this in the value space is let x. And we're going to use the in operator. And the equivalent of this is for let x, basically. Well, let's finish it so that it makes more sense. For every value or every type in K, or yeah, let's just say for every type in K, we're assigning it to X, and then we're going to do something with that X. What did we say we want to do? We want to access T and get the type of that property X. But another thing to note at this point is even though we have squiggly lines, we've passed our first two test cases. I'm just going to take that one once again to really explain what's going on here. K could be, sorry about that. K, as we're using it here, could be think of it as like a list of properties of some type. Typically a list of properties of some type. But more formally, it's a union type of the properties in a type that we're interested in, right? And what we're doing here is for every property in K, we're assigning that property to X, right? And for every X, we're going into T, in this case, T is to do, and we're looking at the value of what X is. So when X is title, the value of X is string, and we're assigning that value of string to the property of title, which is contained in X. So that's what we're doing. And that's why these two cases pass, because when we pass my peak, when we pass my peak to do and we only want the title, what we get is just the title, and that's equal to this expected one type. And when we pass my pick to do, and all we want is the title and the completed, then all we get is the title and completed, which is equal to the expected two type. But we have a problem. We are supposed to throw an error here, but we're not throwing an error, and TypeScript is telling us we're supposed to throw an error. So what could be wrong? What could be wrong? Basically, let's see. Let's see what hints TypeScript is giving us. It's saying that k is not assignable to the type string or number or symbol. And that's a hint to say that k is too broad. K could be something more than a string or a number or a symbol. So that's hint one. And let's look at what this error is. It's saying that x cannot be used to index type t. Again, this is a hint saying that x is too broad, and we may be trying to access a property in the to-do type that does not exist. The solution to both of these problems is to constrain the set of values that k can take on. If we were doing this in the value space in JavaScript, actually JavaScript is not a good example because we don't do types in JavaScript. But if we're doing this in a language like Java or Ruby, we would use a syntax that goes something like int, constraining k to the set of values of int. But in TypeScript, the syntax for doing that is to use the extends keyword. So let's just go ahead and use the extends keyword. But what is the set of values that we want k to be constrained to? Let's think about that. We are taking a type and we want to remove some properties from that type or no properties from that type. So it's kind of intuitive that the only values we want k to ever take on should be limited to the properties of the type and no more. Okay, awesome. Now, how do we get that? We use the keyof property or the keyof operator. The keyof operator basically goes through a type and returns a union of all the properties, of all the keys, all of the properties in that type, or you can think of it as a list of all the properties in that type. So key of t, and that solves our problem. Now k is properly constrained to just the set of types that fall within the list of the properties of the type that we're trying to constrain, that we're trying to cut some properties off from. And let's see if that, yeah, and we can see that gets rid of our error. We're expecting an error. No error was thrown. And that got rid of the squiggly lines saying that no error was being thrown when, oh sorry, I got that wrong. At this point we're not expecting an error. No error is being thrown, so no squiggly lines, versus before when we were expecting an error but no error was being thrown, and TypeScript was telling us that an error was meant to be thrown. I hope I got that last bit correctly. It doesn't sound quite right, but yeah, that's a pick type. That's the type that exists in TypeScript standard library. And that concludes our second challenge of my 65 days of TypeScript challenges. I hope that was informative to anyone who watched up to this point.